So our first speaker is Dexter Van Zile, who is Christian media analyst for CAMERA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, and he's been doing that since 2006. Dexter is a dear friend who has participated in past Liaison Committee programs. He's written extensively about how Christian churches and parachurch organizations have responded to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and has also worked tirelessly to publicize the suffering of Christians in Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East. His writings have appeared in the Boston Globe, the Jerusalem Post, the Allgemeine, PJ Media, the Jewish Political Studies Review, JCPA, and the Graymoor Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute. A Massachusetts native and former Peace Corps volunteer, Dexter received a BA in Politics and Government from the University of Punch and Sound, an MA in Political Science and Environmental Studies from Western Washington University. He will present an introduction to evangelical anti-Zionism. Dexter,
Thank you very much. I want to thank Alan and Petra for organizing this event, and I want to thank everyone for attending. I attended the University of Puget Sound, but it was in Tacoma, so Puget Sound might actually be okay. I spent most of my time in the past several years actually dealing with anti-Zionism in mainline Protestant churches. And one of the things that I did when I was starting to critique and analyze what was going on in the mainline churches was to say that, look, we don't see the same level of activism or animus towards Israel in the evangelical community, which is growing. And we do see it in the mainline community, which is declining. And it seemed as if, that the evangelical community was largely an unassailable bulwark in defense of Israel, which was a good thing because they represented about 40 to 50 million people in the United States, possibly more. And they were generally regarded as the backbone of support for Israel in the United States, and that was typically regarded as a good thing. Largely because of their numbers and because they had the time, energy, and money to invest in political activism to make it clear to political leaders in the United States that support for Israel was a very important thing. There was some hostility directed at Israel, in part because of evangelical support, because there was a lot of people in the United States that didn't like evangelicals. They regarded them as sectarian, and generally, and there was they had a reputation of being anti-intellectual. And basically anti-intellectual Bible thumpers, which I don't think was a fair characterization of the community. But that was basically how they'd been treated in the press. And the thing is that when you look at it, in some instances, you can kind of regard evangelical support for the Jewish state as somewhat of an anomaly because the community's emphasis on salvation through Jesus Christ. And they're very committed to proselytization, and sometimes they do promote the proselytization towards the Jewish people. And also there's this crucicentrism, this notion that essentially there's salvation through the cross. And historically there was, and this was one of the things that the mainliners like to say about the evangelical community, that when it was supported Israel, was that there was an undercurrent of anti-Semitism in the evangelical community that was rooted in a supersessionist theology that the mainliners had said that they had basically abandoned. They had had some form, or some of the churches had their own form of Nostra Aetate to varying degrees of influence or authority within these churches. The United Church of Christ issued probably one of the more powerful statements. That was the church that I grew up in. And what happened was that they used to say, look, those evangelicals, they support Israel for, all the wrong reasons, for the end times prophecy, and ultimately, really all they want to do is to convert the Jews. But the thing is that the dynamic was that, well, at least evangelicals cared about the physical safety of the Jewish people in ways that the mainliners didn't, and that was the response that I gave. And also there was another component of evangelical support. They supported Israel largely because they were also pro-American, and they regarded support for Israel as part of a strong American foreign policy. And also many of them did have Christian Zionist beliefs. Some of them were premillennial dispensationalists. And also some of them actually were horrified by what happened at the Holocaust, and they had a visceral contempt for anti-Semitism, even if they did have a strong belief, or do have a strong belief in, or hope for Jews coming to Jesus Christ. And so there was an awful lot of contradictory impulses playing themselves out. And what is going on now is that I think that there's a very skillful group of activists that are basically trying to lean on those aspects of evangelical identity that would basically promote or to reawaken supersessionism in a way that it hadn't really been activated before. And one of the things is that I had concluded was there was groups like the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem and others that had played largely a providential role in somehow keeping a tamp on that supersessionism, which I found very helpful and hopeful. But what happened is that sometime in around 2010, it was a two-pronged approach. And I'm going to have to unpack that as we proceed, but sometime around 2010, we started to see what some people have started to call the evangelical intifada, which was basically the awakening or the resurgence of anti-Zionism in the evangelical community. And there had always been a certain amount of anti-Zionism based largely on supersessionist theology. And there were people who had been exposed to the Palestinian narrative. And so essentially they supported Israel, but they never really got very much traction. There was a group called the Evangelicals for Middle East Understanding, and there was other groups, and they were around, but they never really got the traction that they had been hoping for. And then all of a sudden, it seemed as if they started to hit their stride in 2010. We saw two movies produced that year, which one was called With God on Our Side, and another one was called Little Town of Bethlehem. And I think With God on Our Little Town of Bethlehem basically tried to portray the Palestinian plight as the equivalent of what happened to African Americans in the United States in the 1950s, and that the Palestinian cause was essentially the fight for civil rights. And they didn't address issues related to Islamist hostility towards Jews or Christians, and they didn't really deal with Hamas. And so a Little Town of Bethlehem, basically, there was a certain hipness to it. That basically it was clear that they were trying to appeal to the young evangelical Protestants who had grown up in the evangelical community, but didn't see the world through the lens that their parents and grandparents did. And one of the things that we have to remember is that the young millennials, the people, evangelical Protestants who are basically in their 20s right now, they don't remember very much about the Holocaust. They know that it was a bad section of history, something bad happened a while back. They don't remember Israel's creation in 1948, and for the most part, they don't really and they have a vague sense of what the '67 war was about. And what happens is that when they come and look at the conflict, what they see is that they see the more powerful state, Israel, basically oppressing the Palestinians and denying them their right to a sovereign state of their own. And the problem is that it's almost an ahistorical narrative, and we're talking and with millennials who have basically postmodern sensibilities, and and I've used the word postmodern, and it's like, what's it mean? Defining postmodernism is like trying to nail a jellyfish to a wall. But the one thing I do know is that it's not about the narrative. I mean, it's all about the narrative, excuse me, and it's not about like necessarily the facts and actually coming to some sort of scientific understanding of what's actually going on. It's whoever's got who comes to anybody with the best story first is actually the way it's going to be. And maybe that's human nature, maybe that's always the way it's been. And I'm going to diverge. I want to tell you, I had a conversation with somebody who was involved in organizing the Christ at the Checkpoint conference, who had told a contradictory story about how the patriarch of his family had died. The story that his other people in his family had told is that we're not really sure how he died. He died during the 1948 war. And what happened was that the Jordanians had compensated the family for his death. So, but they said they never really knew. Well, when he appeared in front of evangelical audiences here in the United States, he said that he was killed by an Israeli sniper, even though that wasn't the story that the rest of his family had told. So there was a certain contradiction here, and I wrote an article about it. And I said, and that really, and I basically confronted him face to face about this. And he said, well, and he basically said, well, I stopped telling that story. Okay? which was about as good as I could expect. I said, okay, so that was kind of an admission that maybe the story wasn't true. But then the conversation continued, and ultimately it was like, well, this is how it is in our society. We tell stories, we tell fables, and we tell legends. And the thing is that works very well, I think, with the millennial postmodern generation, because, you know, the facts. I've just been at the Christ at the Checkpoint conference, and in two instances I've heard people say that the wall completely surrounds Bethlehem. Two people have said it, one of whom was the mayor of Bethlehem. And we're talking about a room full of people, you know, 400 to 600, depending on how many people are there. Many of them are Palestinian Christians from the city itself, okay? And they know that the wall does not completely surround Bethlehem. And I know that it doesn't, and I know that they know that it doesn't, and nobody rose up in objection to it. Okay, nobody said, well, that's not true. And part of it is that it's not the type of environment where you can do that. But at the same time, it's a pretty surreal event for somebody like me who is committed to facts to say that that's not true. And then when you tell people that's not true, they say, well, you know, they do all sorts of things. And at a certain point, you become the unreasonable person for insisting that they actually traffic in facts. Okay? And so I think that's what is going on here, and I diverged a little bit. But there was another movie that came out that year in 2010 called With God on Our Side, and I've already spoken about that in front of another liaison committee. But basically this movie, which was made by Porter Speakman Jr., who is a young evangelical, or he's probably about maybe in his 40s, but he's kind of hip, slick, and cool, and he knows how to speak to the young people in that community. And he knows how to manipulate imagery. Okay? And what he did was he basically told the story of a young Christian Zionist who basically ended up embracing the Palestinian Christian narrative. And the narrative was pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. Okay? And that comes from the Telos group, which is a group that I think Yitzhak is going to speak about later. But what he did in that movie was that he provided a model for young people to basically embrace anti-Zionism. And if you talk to him about that, he'll say, well, that's not what we wanted to do. But that's really what's going on, is that essentially the narrative is that we need to lift up the Palestinian people. The Israelis are largely at fault for it, and that's the way it goes. And in addition to this, and what that movie did was that it provided kind of the model for the narrative that we've seen at all of the Christ at the Checkpoint conferences. The first Christ at the Checkpoint conference was organized in 2010, and it was organized by the Bethlehem Bible College, which was basically run in large part by the Awad family, and Sammy Awad also was involved with an organization called Holy Land Trust. And I think that Yitzhak's going to talk about some of those. But there's basically, what has happened is that the Palestinian Christians associated with the Bethlehem Bible College have basically figured out a way to reach out to young evangelicals in the United States. And they are much smarter than the Zile folks were in the 1990s and 2000s. And one of the things that I like to explain to people on intellectual or shorthand is that the Christ at the Checkpoint conference is Zile for evangelicals. And Zile was generally targeted the mainliners. But this is no Zile conference, because the Zile folks could not restrain their enmity. And they couldn't disguise it, and they couldn't move it around, and they weren't able to basically adapt. And they ended up basically embracing a radical anti-Zionism that was eventually rendered the organization itself radioactive. And that, I don't think, is going to happen with the Christ at the Checkpoint conference. And one of the things, the first time I went to this conference was in 2012. And this is the second time that I've been there. And one of the things that I have learned, largely in my discussions with Luke Moon, who's right over there, and I'm like denouncing him from the podium, is that in 2010 and 2012, there was large numbers of people in the evangelical left associated with Christ at the Checkpoint. They're not there anymore. And I asked Luke why, and he said, well, that's probably because what they're trying to do is to make a play for evangelical conservatives. And so if you have people, and some of you may or may not know these names, but if you have people like Tony Campolo, Lynn Hybels, and Shane Claiborne, who are all basically darlings of the evangelical left, which is a very small group of people, they're going to be very off-putting to evangelical conservatives, okay? And so what we see is that I think that they started to think seriously about how it is that they can make a play for conservative evangelical support for Israel in this community. And the Christ at the Checkpoint message that I saw in 2012 was that basically American support for Israel was hindering evangelization in the Muslim community countries. And that message is largely, I think, present here, but there's another message that we've seen, and maybe Robert can see this, and maybe if you want to talk to Luke during the break, or maybe we can hand him the microphone as well. But one of the things that we've seen is that they argued that Islamic radicalism is caused by Israel's victory in the Six-Day War. That was really when it started to be a problem. Well, in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in the 1920s. But that's just one, and if you tell people that, okay, well, they'll go, well, just like they did when I talked about the security barrier not completely surrounded Bethlehem. And this is one of these things, is that to somehow insist that these people deal with the facts as opposed to basically somehow and tear themselves away from this narrative that they've already embraced, it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think what we are seeing is, and people have talked, and I've talked a little bit about the theology, I think one of the things that they've done to target some of the people who are older than the millennial community is to emphasize the fact that Israel is the state of the Jewish people. And remember, the Jews have rejected Christ, and we care a lot about Jesus, don't we? And so why are we doing this now? And so there's a supersessionism going on. And I think that basically one of the things that I have discovered or been very interested and not very skilled at pointing out, and Richard Landis asked me a question, are there secular supersessionism going on? And that, you see, the Palestinian Christians have figured out which supersessionism every community will respond to, okay? The evangelical community will respond to traditional supersessionism, and that's what they gave them. The mainline Protestants, did not like theological supersessionism, but they did have a certain secular supersessionism. They basically wanted to transcend the nation state. They were basically part of the American left. And so that was what they gave the mainline Protestants. And then with the young millennials, they will give them basically a nice story to tell. So there's a lot going on in whatever community they want that they need to target. They have figured out what message works with each one of them. And in some ways, I'm actually very impressed with the skill of these Palestinian Christians, because they, in some ways, have figured out American society better than the people who actually live in it. They are very sensitive to what works. And if it doesn't work, they dump it and they find something new. For example, at the first Christ at the Checkpoint conference, Naim Atik appeared, okay, from Zile, and he didn't work. So he didn't show up at the next conference. And so they basically mix and match the speakers to find out who's going to actually work with the audience that they're looking for. I think, I only have a couple other points, but what I think we're seeing is that there are people in the evangelical community that want to be good Christians. And one of the things that they want to do is that they want to basically behave like Jesus did. And they want to basically relive the gospel. And so what happens is that I think that there are activists in the Palestinian Christian community and the anti-Zionist community that have figured out a way to basically give them the raw material that they need to somehow be like Jesus. And the thing is that when you look at the gospel, and if you look at it, one of the unfortunate aspects of this is that basically if you look at Christ's passion, Jewish wrongdoing and sin and violence, and also like the St. Stephen, the stoning, that played a big role in basically the early Christian story. Jewish wrongdoing played a big role in it. And so if you can somehow imbue people's story or give them the sense that they are the target of Jewish wrongdoing or criticism, that's going to make them think that somehow that they are living in first century Jerusalem alongside Jesus. And that may sound wacky and crazy, but you know, one of the stories that people like to come back to the United States with is, well, I was spit on a Jew in the old city of Jerusalem. Okay, and sometimes it does happen. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but when that happens to them, it's like, I was like Jesus, and they won't say it out loud, but they will say, "Gee, I know what it's like to basically confront a religious establishment," or something like that. And I think that's a very that's one of the things that's going on. And that doesn't mean, last year they basically tried to downplay altogether the issue of Islamist violence against Christians. Now they're talking about it because they know that the evangelical community cannot ignore it, but they're framing it in such a way so that people are not making the dot or the connections between Islamist violence against Christians and, oh, by the way, they have the same hostility towards Jews. Relevant magazine, which just did a big feature piece about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it's a magazine that I would basically call Rolling Stone for young evangelical millennials. It's basically pictures of hip, slick, and cool evangelicals with scruffy beards that really don't know what to do with their lives. So they, you know, but they did a big story about the Arab-Israeli conflict that did not even deal at all with Islamist hostility towards Israel. But if you look elsewhere in the magazine, they will talk about the mistreatment of Christians at the hands of Muslims in other countries. And so the thing is that they will make the connection of Islamist violence against Christians, but not the connection between of Islamist violence towards Jews in Israel. I think one of the other things, and I know that Robert wanted me to talk about this, is that what we're seeing is the promotion of Occidentalism, which is a distorted view of the West that basically, and I'm basically now stealing a page out of Edward Said, okay? Orientalism basically said that these people, these Westerners basically looked at the Middle East in a way that basically allowed them to oppress it and dominate it. Well, I think what is being done now is that people are promoting a narrative about the West that undermines support for it. And on this point, I want to tell you a story. When I came in last week, I flew in on a Saturday morning, or I stayed at a hotel in East Jerusalem, and I walked in the city, and I found a bookstore in East Jerusalem. And I walked in, and on the first floor, there was a whole bunch of anti-Israel books. Ferocious anti-Israel stuff, but actually it wasn't as bad as the stuff I found upstairs. And I saw what was happening, and I said, oh, I want it. This, I have to come back here. I'm the type of guy that if I know that there's a lot of anti-Israel or anti-Jewish propaganda, I go there because I want it. And I have a great fear of like getting caught with this stuff in Ben Gurion Airport, okay? Because I go, but I went in. There was a book that basically told the history of Hebron that basically erased the Jews from Hebron, okay? And there was other books there, one that by Mustafa Abu Sway, which I paid money for, that talked about how, that how important Jerusalem was to the Muslim community. And then also there was another book that talked about how basically relations between Christians and Muslims has typically been fine in the Holy Land, okay? But I looked at all of the books, and I realized that there was a message being offered. First of all, there was a lot of anti-Israel stuff, there was a lot of anti-Western stuff, and there was a lot of anti-Semitic books, okay, or a few anti-Semitic books. I don't want to exaggerate. But one of them was offered the Khazar narrative, that basically Jews aren't really Jews, they're really Khazars, okay? And I realized that all of that is basically, those books were an attempt to undermine confidence in the West. But there was another set of books that were present in this bookstore. Dawah. There were books associated with basically promulgating Islam. And when you look at it, and I'm one of these, I guess maybe a structuralist, I don't know what you would call me, I'd say, this is not an accident. This is no accident. Somebody knows what they're doing. These books were in English, most of them were in English. There was a few in French, German, and Italian, but the vast majority of them were English. And so what these books were intended to do was to undermine the confidence of young people who came to East Jerusalem to basically get their radical chic on, okay? And this is the books that they were going to be exposed to. Something like that is happening at Christ at the Checkpoint. But the problem is that the mistreatment of Christians is too much on the radar of the evangelical community so for them to be able to get away with that altogether. But ultimately, when they talk about Islamic radicalism being caused by Israel's victory in the Six-Day War in '67, that is about as far as they're going to be able to go. They're basically blaming Islamist violence against Christians on Israel. And so I think what we're seeing is there was another message, and before I've got only a couple more points. Messianic Jews play a huge role in the narrative offered at Christ at the Checkpoint. And they have been playing an increasing role in evangelical anti-Zionism. And it really grieves me to have to talk about this. But what happens is that there are no Jews, qua Jews there. There are Messianic Jews, but there are not any Jews who are committed to Judaism or secular Jews, basically who are embracing their Jewish identity as Jews. There are a lot of Messianic Jews. Mark Braverman, by the way, is there. And for those of you who know who he is, the important thing is that when they get up in front of the audience and start arguing in defense of Israel, one of the assumptions that they have and that they start off with is that their fellow Jews are fallen and that they're in a state of unbelief. And that basically reminds people that indeed the Jewish state, Israel, is for the people who have rejected Jesus Christ. And so what that does is that puts Israel behind the theological 8-ball, so to speak. And one of the messages that I heard given by somebody that is a Messianic Jew is that, well, one of the reasons why Israel was created providentially is possibly because God wants to bring them back to their homeland and to put them into such a painful situation, an impossibly painful situation, that they will have to turn to Jesus Christ. Okay? And that is not a very good defense of the Jewish state, if you ask me. I don't think that's a very good one. I'm going to basically close and say I got 3 more things. Church struggle in the mainline community is a precursor to what is going on in the evangelical community. And if this struggle continues and if they're successful, they're going to unleash forces in American society that we are not going to like the looks of. And I think ultimately the one possible response is to promote a greater love and understanding of the Hebrew Bible in Christianity throughout the world. Thanks.